British illustrator Bernard Partridge was so highly regarded in his lifetime that he was awarded a knighthood for service to his country in 1925. He was born in 1861 in London, the son of an eminent medical professor and surgeon, and once he'd left school he went to work as a trainee with a firm of architects. At the age of 19 he left the architect's office to work as a stained glass designer. And although throughout this time he had continued to draw and paint, it was 1885, when he was 25 years old, that he first tried his hand as an illustrator and watercolour artist. He created illustrations for magazines and books, and he did reasonably well as a painter too. On several occasions he submitted work to Punch magazine, but it took him a few attempts before they finally published a couple of his drawings in 1890. A year later they invited him to join them as a staff artist, and after some characteristic indecision he eventually accepted the offer and stayed with them for the rest of his life. Partridge wasn't a joke writer, but the editorial staff supplied him with the material from which he would create the image. And it was his exceptional ability to translate situations and dialogue into quickly understandable visual humour which rendered him invaluable to the magazine's writers. Throughout the first decade of the 20th century, Partridge's pen and ink images reflected on the changes in society at every level, and took a liberal but firmly middle-class view of events in Britain and around the world. Partridge had become a humorous illustrator at a time when the word cartoon didn't imply a hastily drawn doodle, and his attention to anatomy and posing was nothing short of exceptional. Similarly, his ability to create the illusion of substance with carefully controlled pen and ink hatching was without equal. I can find no definitive evidence to support the idea, but he must have worked from posed models, probably his associates at Punch. It's impossible to imagine that such convincing evocations of humanity weren't observational. In the years before the Great War, Partridge's illustrations mercilessly targeted Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm and his expansionist policies. And when the war inevitably began in 1914, he stepped up the level of vilification with more grim humour. In addition to his work for Punch, he also used his painting skills to create some colour propaganda posters. To date, all his work for Punch had necessarily been monochrome, but as with his propaganda work, he occasionally had other opportunities to use colour. His 1915 collection of detailed and precise watercolours for a collection of poems by Robert Browning showed just how adept he was with the medium. Around the same time, a couple of his illustrations for Punch appeared with the addition of limited spot colours, although by far the bulk of his illustration for the magazine would continue to be line only. Once the war had ended and Britain began to get back to normal, he returned to domestic humour, and he satirised the politicians and social issues of the day throughout the 1920s. His illustration style remained as precise and detailed as it always had been, and he made no concessions to the rise of more modernist minimal approaches. Although Partridge turned 70 in 1931, he was still working at Punch, and around this time the threat to global stability presented by Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party began to ring alarm bells and a feeling of déjà vu. Partridge and his colleagues created many visually eloquent satirical attacks on the Führer, as his ongoing occupation of neighbouring countries made another war inevitable. Partridge lived just long enough to see Hitler's Third Reich destroyed, and he died in 1945 at the age of 84. Joseph Francis Kernan was born in Massachusetts in 1878, making him 16 years older than Norman Rockwell. I mention this because the similarities of style, technique and subject matter of the two can't be ignored. And much as I admire Rockwell, it does get on my nerves that others, such as Kernan, are either hidden by his shadow or relegated to the status of Rockwell clones. He studied at the Erich Schilling School of Art in Boston, and he paid for his art education by playing professional baseball. He would have graduated around 1900, and it's known that he taught for a few years following graduation. But the first dated illustrations I could find are these unpromising covers for Baseball magazine from 1916. In 1920, by which time he was already 42 years old, a sudden flood of his paintings featured on the covers of quite a few magazines, and these images show clearly that his skill levels had improved considerably. The Country Gentleman magazine was particularly keen to have him illustrate their covers with his good-natured homespun images. And in addition to featuring on their covers for more than a decade, he created similar illustrations for others, such as Outdoor Life, The Elks, and the more obscure Capper's Farmer. Before the decade was out, he had also appeared on covers for the Saturday Evening Post, which was of course where Rockwell had made his name and continued to be their most used artist. Even so, by 1936, Kernan had racked up a total of 26 covers. Advertising work had never been part of his ambitions, but every once in a while he did take occasional commissions for posters and press ads. He was one of several illustrators, including Rockwell, who created press ads and posters for Fisk tyres. Kernan's abilities as a draftsman and his dexterity with oil paint marked him out as a truly great realist painter. The visual evidence available strongly suggests he was one of a relatively small number of illustrators who never worked in monochrome, either tonally or in line. But the incredible authority of his pencil sketches gives a clear indication of his level of skill. Kernan's art perfectly captured middle-class American life throughout the 1930s and into the 40s, in magazines, calendars, and the odd advertising campaign. Although he slowed down in later life, he retained his position as one of America's best and most popular realistic illustrators up to his eventual retirement. And after a long and rewarding career, Joseph Kernan died in 1958 at the age of 80. Fred G. Cooper was primarily but not exclusively a cartoon illustrator, and he was adept in a wide range of styles and techniques. He was born in Oregon in 1883, and he studied art very briefly at the Mark Hopkins Institute in San Francisco. Having quit his studies, he headed for New York in 1904 at the age of 21. Almost immediately he began contributing illustrations and cartoons to Life magazine, and this professional relationship would prove to be both lasting and mutually beneficial. At the same time, he was also having some success as a typographer and graphic designer. Within a year of his arrival, his reputation was strong enough for him to be invited to produce virtually all illustrated publicity work for the New York Edison Company. And although Edison alone were keeping him busy and financially stable, he continued to work for several magazines and also found time to illustrate the occasional book or theatre poster. Life continued to rely on him not just for content, but to also create a series of ads to attract more subscribers. And he was responsible for creating a large number of monochrome spot illustrations, which were used repeatedly in every issue of the magazine. In essence, these drawings were an early form of clip art. He even found time to produce occasional illustrations for other magazines, such as Collier's. During America's brief appearance in the Great War, Cooper also created editorial cartoons, and I for one would not have known that these cartoons were by the same person. In the 1920s he maintained his position as one of the most in-demand illustrators of his day, and he continued to demonstrate remarkable levels of graphic diversity and authority in all his commissions. The series of covers he created for Life between 1925 and 1927 show just how eclectic Cooper was in his approach to making pictures. Some are highly sophisticated linear works with anatomy that's only slightly caricatured, and others are far more basic, with anatomy very much in line with characters such as Felix the cat. And these covers also reveal that he was sufficiently accomplished in creating Art Deco images to be able to parody them for comic effect. Cooper invariably created his line work with either pen or brush and ink, and when working in colour it was usually flat spot printing over his line drawing. In the years between the wars, Cooper was remarkably successful and creatively energetic across all areas of the media, and he prospered accordingly. During the Second World War he was too old to fight, but he created several domestic propaganda posters, including this totally out of character representational painting. Again, I would never have known it was him. In 1947 he was appointed editor of the Subway Sun newspaper, and it's at this time that examples of his illustration become very scarce. This pair of coffee posters from the early 50s are all I've been able to find. His appointment at the Sun may have kept him too busy to carry on as an illustrator, or maybe at 65 years old he considered it a good enough time to retire from freelance work. But whatever the reason, all we know of his later life is that he died in 1962 at the age of 79. Erich Schilling is yet another in a long line of German illustrators whose work was highly regarded in his lifetime, but whose political affiliations led to him being somewhat of an embarrassment. He was born in 1885 in the town of Sull in central Germany, and in 1903 he left to study at the Berlin School of Art, and he continued to live and work in Berlin in the years that followed. In 1905, at the age of only 20, he had some of his work published in Der Wahr Jakob, a satirical magazine with affiliations to the outlawed left-wing Social Democrat Party. But 2 years later he also began contributing to the rival Simplicissimus magazine, and it was in their pages that the overwhelming majority of his illustrations would appear for the rest of his career. In the years leading up to the First World War, his frequently angry misanthropic images covered the wide range of expected targets any satirical illustrator would naturally take aim at. Authority in general, government corruption, and the less savoury aspects of the church could always be relied on to provide ammunition. But once war had been declared, he joined the rest of the team at Simplicissimus in turning his attention to Germany's enemies and their supposedly evil warmongering ways. By the time the war had ended in 1918, his commitment to Simplicissimus led him to relocate to a small town just outside Munich, where the magazine was published. Schilling was unusual among his contemporaries, as he never relied on one particular style. Some of his work was created lithographically and was possessed of sinewy grace, while other images resembled the more brutal look of medieval woodcuts. And it was a similar story with his approach to colour, which was applied tonally using washes and charcoal shading, and frequently as flat spot colour. When Adolf Hitler and his National Socialists came to power in 1933, the artists and writers of Simplicissimus were given the choice of either getting out while they could or getting on board with Nazi ideology. Schilling chose the latter option, and from that point on created anti-Semitic and xenophobic images which must have made the Führer proud. Whether this was a genuine change of heart or simply a question of self-preservation isn't recorded. Simplicissimus fell apart in 1944, and when it became glaringly obvious to even the most die-hard Nazi that Germany had lost the war, Erich Schilling committed suicide as American troops approached Munich in 1945. So it seems his love for the Führer was genuine after all. And that's the somewhat depressing end of this instalment. See you next time, I hope, and bye for now.